Hi, this is Samyut, and today we're going to be presenting the MirusCast. I'm here talking about how games are getting easier with Avinash.
Yeah. So it's no secret that games have been getting easier. For example, games like Mega Man and Battletoads were not very hard, not impossible to beat, with things only one life or no difficulty curve. And games nowadays will have many lives or regenerating health. I'm looking at you, COD. So, Samyut, why do you think that's happening?
I think this is because nowadays there are more games out in the market, and they can afford to make games that aren't as hard because they can keep adding more and more games, and so that way they force more compulsive buying and less focusing on one game.
Yeah. What I think it is because basically developers when someone pays for their game, they only get that money that someone paid for their game, right? It's not like in an arcade where you have to keep paying for lives and things like that, right? So so by this logic, if they made their games easier and thus quicker to finish, that means that people would keep buying more new games, which means that which means developers get more money. Also, I think because in that time when lives were monetized in the arcade, of course, the arcade games were meant to be difficult or at least with an inevitable death. So that when developers moved the games to home consoles, these games were similar because they had that mindset. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think you're right because arcade games, obviously, they could force compulsive buying because they could actually collect the money at the end of the day. But when they started using consoles, it was more about making money directly through selling the games and less of actually making money day to day from what everyone's paid. So, and when they were making it in arcades, they had to make it easier because harder, sorry, because that way people would buy it more, and once they moved it to console games, they didn't have as much a source of reliable profit, so they made it easier. And I think this is actually in some ways good for the developers, but overall I think it's kind of bad because as we can see with more and more games, there's more and more hate coming towards those games, and this is bad for the community. But it may be good for the developers who are making more money. But even then, I
Yeah.
believe it's worse for the community.
Yeah. Anyway, so I just wanted to add one more point. I think that the reason it's better for developers is because more people can play easier games without like getting frustrated and quitting, right? So that means more people would buy it. And essentially what it means is easier games are better to monetize. I mean, easier games bring in more money. And and also I want to talk about like how this has changed the game industry. So, well, the biggest change I think is that gaming has become more accessible and is slowly becoming more mainstream. And well, I think that while in some cases it's sort of good, I don't think that the way developers are handling it isn't good. See, basically, the reason many people sorry, the reason many people get into gaming or try to games is because the games they try seem really approachable and fun. But the easiest way for a developer to do this is to make the game easy. However, there are other ways, just like making sure you include a good tutorial level, making sure that the controls and mechanics are intuitive, and things like that. So I think that while it isn't good for developers to make 100% easy games, it has helped gaming in some ways.
I actually think that like it does help the gaming itself and attracts newer crowds. But as I said before, I don't think this very helps the community a lot because when you play an easy game, it's harder for you to enjoy the game, so you always want more, and then that's that where all the complaints start and people get angry. And Yeah.
All right. Anyway, so what I think is that for existing gamers, sometimes they might want more of a challenge, right? So that's why they might not have as much fun playing these more simplistic games. But for newer gamers, it's more fun because they aren't really used to controls and things like that. And well, I think like you said, some part of it is sort of bad for the community, but it also can be good. So I think that there should be a good balance between both of them.
Yeah, I guess you're right because in most cases balance is usually better, but I still think that when you're making a game easier or harder, then if you make it harder, it's I think it's still better for existing players who are usually the larger consumer base.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm just gonna move on to our next subtopic, I guess. It's I'm gonna be talking about what I feel are the different types of difficulty and how they should be implemented. So, in my opinion, there are three different types of difficulty. The first one is just luck difficulty, which are things like Candy Crush and slots, which aren't really fun, but waste a lot of time and sometimes require you to pay to make it easier. These are like cheap difficulties. The second one is skill platformer difficulty. I just call it platformer because that's the thing most related to it. This type of skill is related rather than like knowing the mechanics well. It's more related to reflexes and button timing. And games like Mario and Mega Man do this. It can be done well if it involves a good learning curve, but it's possible that it won't be done well with a too high learning curve or a too easy learning curve. And the final one is mechanics difficulty. This is I brushed upon it earlier. This is difficult because it requires you to master the mechanics. And these games like Dark Souls and Shovel Knight. Again, this one can be implemented badly, like immediately requiring you to suddenly start analyzing the game from the starting point and not really understand what's going on. But if it's done well, it's like the best type of difficulty, in my opinion, because with each death, you learn to get better, and the player eventually finally accomplishes what seemed like an unsurmountable task. So yeah,
Yeah, I agree with you about the third type being the hardest difficulty, and I think like the first type slot difficulty is the one that usually gets developers more money, and this is the one which gamers will keep coming back to, and it's more similar to the older arcade games.
yeah, but there's one thing I want to counter about that is that even though there are those type of slot games, you only generally find them on the mobile phone, where you in that I think it's because while there are a few good games on the mobile, most of the games are pretty bad. And similarly, sorry, but if it were to be implemented on something like a console or a PC, since there's so many other good games, gamers would just move to those games instead. Hearing how this game is addictive and has microtransactions and things like that.
Yeah, in that case, I think even on consoles, the second difficulty is more ideal. Is not is the least ideal for developers to make, so we can see that those types of games aren't as popular. And the third difficulty is clearly the most popular one, as we can see in consoles, because in the second type, developers can't really make money, and those are like very similar to older arcade games. Because a few of them, for example, Mario, they're similar, and but the problem is they can't really make much money. The only reason a few of them survive, like Mario, is because they have a huge fan base.
Yeah. Also, in my opinion, so according to you, what would be the best way to implement difficulty in a game?
I think depending on the game, I mean, depending on the medium, for example, if you had a phone then I think the best thing to do would probably be to keep something in the second tier of difficulty. For example, the recent Super Mario Run it was a huge hit, and that was not a slot game. It was under the second difficulty, and uh, then for consoles and PCs, I guess would be the third difficulty because third difficulty, and for PCs it would be the second difficulty. The only problem is that you can't get a lot of money, so the only way to get it is to make sure it's a good game if you're implementing
Yeah.
the second type.
Yeah. I have to disagree with you on a few points. Like on mobile, at least when I play, I find that when I play most games on mobile, except for games like Candy Crush, I find that the controls generally aren't really intuitive. And when it comes to a skill based game which requires a mastery of the controls and skill based button timing, if the controls aren't intuitive, it can get really frustrating really fast. Also, I think on both PC and console, I feel that the game should be the third type. I think that I already said it's the best in my opinion. So yeah, there's that. But I just want to go more in depth. I think that uh games should be a balance of both easy and challenging, and which, which allows and this will allow new gamers to be introduced to the mechanics and become much better, and they will also allow experienced or skilled players to be challenged, and because they'll just breeze through the first part and then start really good. Also, what one more thing I want to talk about is how it should be implemented in online games.
In online games, I think the ideal thing would have to be the third difficulty because it's very hard to pull off a good online game with the second difficulty, as it's like a few examples of pulling off such games are Gravity Man, where you have two players running along side by side, but even then, that mode is not very popular. So I think the best thing to do would probably just be a third difficulty tier game.
Yeah, I think that it should be a mix of the second and the third, because, like, for example, a game like CSGO, it has deep mechanics, but even if you understand the mechanics, nothing can beat just practicing and getting better.
Yeah, I also, one more thing I wanted to talk about was that I think for indie developers, the best type of game to implement would be the second type of difficulty, because if they implement the first type of difficulty, that they can't make a lot of money on computers, and if they implement the third type of difficulty, then it's going to be very hard and expensive for them to make. And if they make the second type of difficulty, however, it still renders the same profit as it would the third difficulty.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, so I have a few more things to say. Well, all right. I need to just collect my thoughts. Sorry, give me a second. Okay, so as I went back to the three types of difficulty, right? There's luck difficulty, skill platformer difficulty, and mechanics difficulty. I think that I think that one important thing I forgot to mention was that in online games like League of Legends and stuff, a lot of people what do you call this? A lot of developers, I mean, they implement this thing called perfect imbalance or cyclical imbalance, which basically means that for example, let's say night A is slightly better than all the other nights. Character A is slightly better than all the other characters. So a lot of people use that, right? And then so many people might sorry, I'm not able to talk. Okay, so because many people are using that, other people will figure out how to counter that using that character B, and then more people will start using character B, and character A will start to seem weak, and like that just continues over and over to allow
Uh,
for like an ever changing playfield.
Yeah, I think this one is kind of ideal in some areas because uh um because for some people they can get used to this type of gameplay. It's just for this is probably more useful to put in a PC game as opposed to a console game, as in this type of scenario you can easily pull off uh having many characters.
Yeah. Also, I just want to talk about for a bit like nostalgia, hardcore gamers, and casual gamers. So, when you look at hardcore gamers, a lot of well, I might not know from personal experience, but like at least how I've seen it online is a lot of people, like a lot of quote unquote hardcore gamers, they either play extremely challenging modern games or just play older games. And while I think that's their choice, but I also think that the reason they do that is because of nostalgia, at least the older games, because a lot of the time when you play something as a kid, later when you remember it slightly better. So, but when you go back to it, you realize it's like compared to the games you're playing now, it's hard as nails. And basically, if you force yourself to do that, you feel really accomplished by the end. So yeah, and finally, I want to talk about quote unquote casual gamers. These are the gamers who like have just gotten in, sort of just play whenever they have time, are a bit busy maybe, and things like that. You find most of these on the mobile platform. I think for these people, like the type of gamers who just want something to waste a bit of time, then the easy game platform. I mean, an easier game is actually better for them because they don't actually need to like think or like practice or try hard to actually beat the game or to feel good in the game or anything like that.
Yeah, I think because hardcore gamers play these games as children, they and when they're growing, they get very attached to these games. So for that reason, they'll have nostalgia and want to come back. And uh, when they if they can complete the game as children, they obviously want to be able to complete it as adults. And uh, so that's one of the reasons they prefer these older games. And but for casual gamers, as you said, they like just playing easier games and things like that. And I think it's actually better for casual to target casual gamers because there's more casual gamers than hardcore gamers, and not many people have the time or put enough effort into playing games.
Yeah. I want to talk about a bit about the difference between challenging and punishing. So, when I look at a challenging game, I feel like the challenge is fair, and I feel like okay, if I practice or if I try to understand this a bit better and things like that, I can get better at the game, and then eventually I'll be able to defeat this person or this thing. But in punishing games, they require you to make that thing like immediately. So basically, you keep dying over and over again. You keep getting very frustrated. That was what I feel is the problem with many of the older difficult games. Is that they were punishing and frustrating and just had you dying over and over until you master that one level and just do it like that and then repeat the same thing for the next level. But in my opinion, good difficulty only comes from learning the mechanics and understanding how you play. Oh, and that's one other thing. I think that good difficulty requires you to practice as well as to think on your feet and to think like how would I approach the situation. For example, there's there's this one part in Dark Souls where which I found pretty cool. So essentially when you're walking down a corridor, you there's an opening, the corridor becomes wider, and you see an enemy in front of you. So as you walk towards that enemy, an enemy comes out behind you and stabs you and backstabs you or whatever. So then so then that way either you had to think before and look around since you're in third person you can like look around and stuff, or you have to understand, okay, next time I'll do that, and then you can just go back and do it.
Yeah, I think when you look at some games, they will be like that. In a lot of first person shooters, what they try to do is they keep varying difficulties. And when you put some, for example, Call of Duty on veteran difficulty, or even harder, Call of Duty Black Ops 3 on realistic difficulty, you can get basically two shot by anybody. So you almost have to memorize the positions of every uh enemy and when they're gonna fire bullets and like look at the patterns, and that's
Yeah.
where the difficulty comes from.
Yeah. I also coming off your point, I want to talk about how higher difficulties is implemented. So when you look at when you look at most games, what they do to implement a higher difficulty, sorry, they just increase enemy health and enemy damage, and maybe debuff you. So so for example, in older games, you didn't have difficulty settings. However, in newer games, you can choose whether you want the enemies to be underpowered or overpowered. But I feel when you're increasing difficulty like that, you should make it a completely new experience, because people who want games to become harder again, when they say they play through a game in easier difficulty and then they go through the hard difficulty, they already know all the enemy positions, they already know all the enemy tactics. But I think that for a game to genuinely become hard, you have to change the enemy position, you have to change the enemy AI to surprise those hardcore gamers who felt like it was just going to be a walk in the park.
Yeah, I think you're right about that because in older games, there were a lot more randomly generated things, and enemies could spawn. The first time you die, enemies would be uh to your like swarming at you from the left. If you died at a different time, they could be swarming at you from your right, and that's what made these games harder because they had less of a pattern and more of actual, you had to use more of actual skill to like try to beat them.
Sorry, no game comes to mind. Can you give me an example?
For example, even in uh Racket Ral sorry for example, in Pac-Man, there were a few versions where they would spawn ghosts from different areas, and you had to like try to run away, and the power pelts obviously are normally spawned in different areas and things like that. And in some of those older versions, you could be spawned on the opposite side of the one side of the map, and the power pelts could be spawned in a different corner. All of
Yeah.
them.
So, oh wow. So, I'm just going off your point. I think that when that type of thing, random generation in roguelike games, when they're well implemented, they can actually be fun because it requires you to master the basic mechanics. But after that, you need to constantly change your strategy to whatever situation you face. But I think those can only be well implemented if they're not everything's not rushing at you, not giving everything is not rushing at you, so you'll have time to think, like to look at the situation and think, okay, what should I do now? And then, yeah,
Yeah, I think you're right, and overall, I think there are a few factors which make these games easier or more fun. And to summarize what we've talked about, basically, games are becoming easier because developers can afford to make more games and want people to buy them more. And the older games were harder because they were in an arcade setting where you had to constantly keep paying for more lives, or and there were more in-game purchases. And there's even with these two types of difficulties, it's generally overall the games are still becoming easier in their feel or setting.
yeah. So, I'm just gonna add on a bit. So, also we talked about what the impact this had, as well as whether we think it's good or bad, and how that was sort of mixed opinion. And we also talked about how the different types of difficulty were implemented in older games and newer games. So yeah, thank you for listening. Hope you have a great day. This was the MirusCast, and yeah, thank you.